The name Davis was once the ultimate currency in Texas, a signature that commanded the global flow of oil and bent the laws of Fort Worth to its absolute will. This dynasty rose from the dirt of the Great Depression, forged by an uneducated World War I pilot who clawed his way up from poverty to build an $800 million industrial colossus. At their zenith, they ruled from the marble halls of the Stonegate mansion, a fortress of excess where the champagne flowed endlessly. But the golden facade shattered on a hot August night in 1976. A figure dressed in black wearing a woman's long-haired wig, allegedly Cullen Davis himself, stormed the $6 million palace. He executed his wife's 12-year-old daughter in the basement, blasted his estranged wife Priscilla in the chest, leaving her maimed but alive, and gunned down her lover in cold blood. Yet the true horror is not the massacre itself, but the aftermath. The Cullen Davis empire proved that in America, if your mountain of gold is high enough, you can wash the blood off your hands and walk away a free man. The Davis fortune was built on a ruthless, primitive conquest of the earth. The patriarch, Kenneth W. Stinky Davis, stands as the primal architect of this tragedy, a man whose life arc defines the brutal trajectory of the American dream in its rawest form. Born into the crushing anonymity of rural Pennsylvania poverty, Kenneth possessed no pedigree, no connections, and barely a sixth-grade education. He was a creature of the trenches, literally and figuratively, serving as a pilot in the chaotic skies of World War I before drifting south to Texas, drawn by the scent of the oil boom like a shark to blood. He began his ascent at the absolute bottom of the industrial food chain, sweating as a clerk in a dusty supply shop. Yet beneath the layer of engine grease lay a predatory genius for commerce. Kenneth recognized early on that the true power in the oil fields did not belong to the gamblers drilling the holes, but to the merchants selling the steel. He executed a masterful takeover of the struggling mid-continent supply company, transforming it through sheer force of will into Cullen Davis Industries International. This entity grew into a terrifying industrial hydra. It controlled the exploration, the drilling, the refining, and the transportation of energy. It was a closed loop of profit that operated with the efficiency of a machine and the morality of a crocodile. By the time of his death in 1968, the empire Kenneth built was valued at $800 million, a staggering sum that, adjusted for inflation, rivals the GDP of small nations. Kenneth Stinky Davis did not merely build a business, he built a fiefdom. He ruled his subordinates and his competitors with an iron fist, earning his nickname not just from the smell of the oil fields, but from the abrasive, unrelenting force of his personality. He crushed opposition. He swallowed smaller companies. He extracted wealth from the ground with a violence that mirrored his management style. This brutality extended directly into the domestic sphere. The Davis household was not a home, it was a training camp for industrial warfare. Kenneth viewed his three sons, Kenneth Jr., Cullen, and Bill, as extensions of his own ego, assets to be hardened and deployed. He managed his family with the same cold ledger book logic he applied to his oil rigs. He instilled in them a dangerous, toxic belief that the Davis name was a fortress, impenetrable to the laws that governed ordinary men. He taught them that money was the only scorecard that mattered and that empathy was a weakness to be excised. The dynamic between the father and the second son, Thomas Cullen Davis, was particularly volatile. Cullen grew up in the shadow of a giant, molded by a father who demanded absolute obedience and material success. The immense wealth surrounding their upbringing did not nurture them. It insulated them. It created a vacuum where consequences did not exist. They were raised in a world where problems were solved with checks, and people were treated as disposable inventory. When Kenneth Davis finally succumbed to mortality in 1968, the cap was blown off the well. He left behind a massive, complex conglomerate and a trio of sons who had been raised to conquer but never taught to govern their own impulses. The transition of power was immediate. The death of the patriarch unleashed the accumulated pressure of decades. The immense machinery of Ken Davis Industries, with its thousands of employees and global reach, was now in the hands of men who had inherited the arrogance of their father, but lacked his disciplined survival instincts. The fortune was vast, the power was absolute, and the stage was set for a descent into madness. The oil had been pumped, the money had been stacked, and the fuse had been lit long before the first shot was fired. The death of Kenneth "Stinky" Davis in 1968 did not merely mark the end of a biological life. It triggered a seismic and violent shift in the tectonic plates of Texan power. When the patriarch was lowered into the dry, unforgiving earth of Fort Worth, the era of the builder was extinguished, and the era of the emperor began. The keys to the kingdom, a sprawling industrial leviathan worth nearly $1 billion, were not passed to a board of directors or a committee of seasoned trustees. They were handed by the primitive law of bloodline to the sons. Among them, Thomas Cullen Davis emerged not just as a beneficiary, but as the dark gravitational center of the dynasty. He was 35 years old, possessing a fortune that rivaled the GDP of small sovereign nations. Yet he carried within him a terrifying emptiness that no amount of oil money could ever fill. To the public, he was the quiet, bespectacled scion of a legendary family, a man of few words and vast resources. To those who lived in his orbit, he was a ticking bomb encased in a three-piece suit, a creature of cold calculation whose very silence was a weapon. The transfer of this immense wealth evokes a profound sense of indignation. Cullen Davis had never experienced the desperation that forged his father. He had never tasted the dust of a poverty-stricken childhood in Pennsylvania, nor had he felt the adrenaline of dogfighting in the skies of World War I. He was the ultimate product of nepotism, a man who stood on third base and believed he had hit a triple. The fortune he inherited was not just money, it was a weaponized infrastructure. Ken Davis Industries International was a closed ecosystem of profit, a conglomerate of 80 companies that controlled every aspect of the energy extraction process. From the drill bit grinding into the rock to the rubber hoses transporting the crude, the Davis family owned the entire vertical chain. They didn't just participate in the economy, they owned the environment. And Cullen, with his sociopathic detachment, treated this empire not as a responsibility, but as a divine right. The psychological profile of Cullen Davis is a study in reptilian dominance. He earned the moniker the Iceman for a reason. Unlike his father, who was known for his boisterous, crude charisma and his ability to scream at subordinates until the walls shook, Cullen operated in a register of terrifying quietness. He spoke in a low, monotone drone that forced people to lean in, a subtle power play that made every conversation feel like a tribunal. He hid behind thick, black-rimmed glasses that acted as a barrier between him and the rest of the human species, masking eyes that observers frequently described as dead or flat. There was no spark of warmth, no flicker of empathy. When he looked at a person, he did not see a human being with hopes and fears. He saw an asset, a liability, or an obstacle. This dehumanization was absolute. To Cullen, a wife was no different from a drilling rig, useful when functioning, expensive when broken, and easily replaceable when obsolete. The rumor engine of Fort Worth society churned relentlessly with stories of his bizarre, controlling behavior. Whispers circulated through the country clubs and boardrooms about his temper. Not a hot, fiery rage, but a cold, sudden snap that was far more dangerous. A waiter bringing the wrong vintage of wine, a girlfriend arriving 5 minutes late, a subordinate questioning a minor directive. These trivial ripples in his reality could trigger a disproportionate, vicious response. He demanded absolute control over his environment. The temperature of the room, the arrangement of the furniture, the clothing of the women on his arm, everything had to align with his specific, rigid internal logic. He moved through Fort Worth like a feudal lord, inspecting his serfs. The police, the judges, and the politicians were not authority figures to him. They were merely employees he hadn't put on the payroll yet. He operated with a sense of impunity that is nauseating to witness, a belief that the laws of physics and the penal code of Texas were optional guidelines that applied to the poor, not to a man whose net worth hovered near 10 figures. This sense of entitlement was amplified by the toxic culture of the 1970s oil boom. This was an era of unchecked excess, a time before corporate responsibility or public scrutiny, where the good old boy network was the only law that mattered. Cullen Davis was the apex predator of this ecosystem. He surrounded himself with a sycophantic entourage, an army of yes men, lawyers, and hangers-on who laughed at his unfunny jokes and validated his worst impulses. They fed his ego until it bloated into a grotesque distortion of reality. They insulated him from the word no. When a man is never told no, his morality begins to atrophy. He loses the ability to distinguish between what he can do and what he should do. Cullen Davis could buy anything, so he believed he could do anything. The boundaries of decent human behavior dissolved in the solvent of his wealth. The internal dynamics of the Davis family added fuel to this combustible mix. While Cullen presented a united front to the world, the boardroom of Davis Industries was a snake pit. The relationship between Cullen and his older brother, Ken Davis Jr., was fraught with a bitter, simmering rivalry. Ken Jr. was the designated heir apparent, the serious businessman who tried to emulate his father's work ethic. Cullen was the wild card, the brother who wanted the power without the accountability. The rumor engine suggests that their fights were legendary, clashes of ego that threatened to tear the conglomerate apart. Cullen resented Ken's authority. Ken resented Cullen's recklessness. This friction created a pressure cooker environment where Cullen felt constantly the need to assert his dominance, to prove that he was not the lesser Davis. He channeled this aggression into his lifestyle, determined to outspend, outparty, and outlive his siblings. He needed to be the biggest object in the room, the center of gravity that pulled everyone else into the abyss. The disgust evoked by Cullen's lifestyle is rooted in his treatment of women. To the Iceman, women were commodities. They were trophies to be displayed, polished, and discarded. He gravitated towards a specific type. Flashy, blonde, and subservient, he used his wealth as a lure, dangling diamonds and furs to trap them in his gilded cage. But once the door was locked, the charm evaporated. He was possessive to the point of paranoia. He viewed his partners as property, subject to the same rigorous inventory controls as his oil pipes. He tapped phones. He hired private investigators. He demanded to know their whereabouts at every second of the day. This was not love. It was surveillance. It was the behavior of a warden, not a husband. And like any warden, he reacted with extreme violence when a prisoner tried to escape. As the 1970s progressed, the boredom of the ultra-rich began to set in. When you have conquered the material world by age 35, when you own jets and islands, the thrill of acquisition fades. Cullen began to drift toward the edges of morality, seeking a rush that simple commerce couldn't provide. The boardroom was too sterile. The country club was too polite. He began to crave chaos. He started associating with characters from the underbelly of Fort Worth, drug dealers, pimps, and hitmen. He found a strange kinship with the criminal element. They too operated outside the law, just like him. The only difference was the quality of their suits. This descent into the underworld was not an accident. It was a choice. Cullen Davis was bored with being a respectable billionaire. He wanted to play in the mud, confident that his money would act as a detergent if he ever got dirty. The schadenfreude of his impending fall is rooted in this colossal hubris. Cullen Davis stood atop his mountain of gold, looking down on the sprawling plains of Texas, believing he was untouchable. He believed the Davis name was a magic spell that could banish any consequence. He did not see that the very isolation he cherished was making him vulnerable. He was rotting from the inside out, his soul corroded by the rust of unearned privilege. He was a king with no kingdom of the heart, a ruler of a sterile empire who was about to invite disaster into his life. He was building a life that looked perfect on the surface, the cars, the clothes, the power, but the foundation was cracked. He was a man who had never been punched in the face, literally or metaphorically, and he was walking blindly into a fight he couldn't buy his way out of. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The quiet businessman was slowly being replaced by the dark prince of Fort Worth. The eyes behind the thick glasses grew colder. The temper grew shorter. The demands grew more unreasonable. He was testing the limits of his power, pushing the boundaries further and further just to see if anyone would dare to stop him. He was like a child playing with matches in a room full of gasoline, fascinated by the flame, oblivious to the explosion that was inevitably coming. The tragedy of Cullen Davis is that he had everything a human being could possibly want, and he decided it wasn't enough. He needed absolute submission from the world around him. And when the world finally refused to submit, specifically in the form of a feisty, leather-wearing blonde named Priscilla, the Iceman would finally shatter, revealing the jagged shards of the monster beneath. Every tyrant needs a castle, and for Thomas Cullen Davis, that castle was Stonegate. This was not merely a residence, it was a physical manifestation of a billion-dollar ego, a sprawling, brutalist monument to excess that sat upon a hill in Fort Worth like a spaceship that had crash-landed in the middle of a polite suburb. The story of its construction is, in itself, a study in pettiness and spite. The mansion was not born from a desire for a warm family hearth. It was born from a bitter, fratricidal squabble over real estate. After the death of patriarch Kenneth Davis, Cullen had set his sights on his father's original estate, a symbol of the family's power. When he lost that battle to his brother Ken Jr., the Iceman reacted with characteristic cold fury. He decided to build something bigger, darker, and infinitely more expensive just to prove a point. He purchased a prime tract of land at 4,100 Mockingbird Lane and poured $6 million, an astronomical sum in 1972, equivalent to nearly $50 million today, into constructing a fortress that would eclipse everything else in Texas. The architecture of Stonegate evokes a sense of shock and alienation. It was designed to intimidate, not to welcome. Spanning nearly 20,000 square feet, the structure was a labyrinth of contemporary design, constructed from stark wood, cold steel, and acres of glass. It turned its back on the street, presenting a windowless, fortress-like facade to the public, while the interior opened up into a complex series of levels and courtyards. It was a house without a soul, a museum of wealth where the air conditioning always seemed to hum a little too loudly, chilling the rooms to a meat locker temperature that suited Cullen's reptilian metabolism. The interior was filled with over 100 oil paintings, not because Cullen loved art, but because he bought culture by the square yard. He hired curators to fill the walls with expensive canvases, treating masterpieces like wallpaper, mere textures to absorb the sound of his own silence. The layout of the mansion feeds the rumor engine with details that border on the sinister. The house was riddled with secrets. It featured a complex system of tunnels and service corridors that allowed staff and perhaps illicit guests to move unseen between the wings. The technological sophistication was paranoid in its scope. The master bedroom, Cullen's inner sanctum, was a command center. A panel of buttons allowed him to control the lighting, the security gates, the temperature, and the audio systems of the entire estate without ever leaving his bed. He could monitor the movements of his family like a warden in a panopticon. The indignation arises from this architectural control freakery. He built a home where he could play God, where every light switch and door lock was an extension of his will. But Stonegate was not just a fortress. It was a playground for the damnable. By the mid-1970s, the mansion had become the epicenter of Fort Worth's high society hedonism. The Stonegate parties were legendary whispering campaigns of depravity that swirled through the church-going communities of Texas. This was the era of the swinging 70s. But at Stonegate, the pendulum swung with a violent, drug-fueled momentum. The mansion became a collision point where the old money of the oil fields met the new morality of the sexual revolution. Imagine the scene: the massive indoor swimming pool, a cavernous room humid with chlorine and lust, where the elite of Texas stripped off their tailored suits and diamond necklaces to indulge in orgies that would make Caligula blush. The disgust is visceral when describing the atmosphere. Cocaine was not an illicit secret. It was a condiment served on silver platters as casually as hors d'oeuvres. The bathrooms, with their gold fixtures and marble counters, became confessionals for addiction. The rumor engine suggests that key parties, where husbands and wives swapped partners based on keys drawn from a bowl, were a staple of the Stonegate social calendar. Cullen Davis, the quiet, bespectacled voyeur, presided over this chaos like a dark Gatsby. He watched the debauchery from behind his thick glasses, rarely participating with the wild abandon of his guests, but drawing a sick sense of power from facilitating it. He provided the venue, the drugs, and the alcohol, turning his home into a human zoo for his own amusement. The presence of Priscilla Davis, the woman who would eventually become both the queen and the victim of this castle, added a layer of chaotic energy to the sterile halls. If Cullen was the ice, Priscilla was the fire. She moved into Stonegate and tried to fill its empty, echoing spaces with her loud, brash personality. She was the one who invited the eclectic mix of bikers, cowboys, and socialites. She turned the mansion into a salon for the weird and the wonderful, but the house rejected her. Stonegate was built for Cullen's control, not Priscilla's chaos. The clash between their lifestyles turned the mansion into a battlefield. The stark modern lines of the house seemed to amplify their screams during their legendary fights. The tunnels that were meant for servants became escape routes for Priscilla when Cullen's temper flared. The indoor pool, once a symbol of luxury, became a place of danger where drunken arguments echoed off the water. The sheer wastefulness of Stonegate triggers a profound schadenfreude in retrospect. Here was a $6 million structure, built with the finest materials on earth, yet it felt like a mausoleum. It was a house designed for a life that didn't exist. It had 5 bedrooms and 11 bathrooms, yet it felt empty. It had troves of art, yet it lacked beauty. It was a monument to the spiritual vacuum of the Davis dynasty. The mansion was disconnected from the reality of the world outside its gates. While the economy fluctuated and ordinary people struggled to pay their mortgages, Cullen Davis was spending thousands of dollars a month just to air condition his art collection. He built a private universe where he made the laws, unaware that the walls he erected to keep the world out would eventually trap him in a nightmare of his own making. The trophy room serves as the ultimate symbol of this grotesque luxury. Filled with the taxidermied heads of exotic animals Cullen had slaughtered on his safaris, the room was a temple to death. Glass eyes of lions, elephants, and rhinos stared down at the guests snorting cocaine on the coffee tables. It was a macabre foreshadowing. Cullen surrounded himself with things he had killed, oblivious to the fact that the smell of death was already seeping into the foundation of the house. The violence he inflicted on the animal kingdom was a precursor to the violence he would unleash on his own family. The guns were already in the cabinet. The mindset was already in place. Stonegate was not a home. It was a hunting ground waiting for its prey. As the marriage between Cullen and Priscilla began to disintegrate, Stonegate transformed from a party palace into a war zone. The locks were changed. The security codes were altered. The surveillance systems were turned inward. The mansion became the central piece on the chessboard of their divorce. Priscilla refused to leave, clinging to the luxury she had married into, while Cullen seethed with the rage of a landlord who couldn't evict a tenant. The house itself seemed to absorb the toxicity. The white carpets were stained with wine and spilled secrets. The swimming pool water grew murky with neglect. The grandeur of the architecture began to look sinister, the sharp angles of the roofline resembling the blade of a guillotine hanging over their heads. In the end, Stonegate was the perfect stage for the tragedy that followed. A regular suburban house could not have contained the operatic scale of the Davis bloodlust. It required a castle. It required tunnels and secret entrances. It required a setting that was as detached from reality as the killer himself. The mansion stood on the hill, glowing in the Texas night, a beacon of wealth that was rotting from the inside. It was a place where money had purchased everything except happiness, and where the silence of the hallways was about to be broken by the deafening roar of a .38 caliber handgun. The party was over, the guests were leaving, and the demons were coming home to roost in the $6 million tomb. If Stonegate was the stage for the Davis tragedy, the marriage between Thomas Cullen Davis and Priscilla Lee Childers was the script, written in acid and sealed with a kiss that tasted of cyanide. Their union was not a romance. It was a collision of two volatile elements that should never have occupied the same space. The timing of their wedding alone serves as a grim forensic indicator of the pathology at play. On August 29, 1968, mere hours after Cullen's father, the terrifying patriarch, Stinky Davis, drew his final breath, Cullen did not weep. He did not retreat into mourning. Instead, he drove to a courthouse and married Priscilla. The soil on his father's grave was not yet turned before he installed a new queen in the empire. It was a gesture of breathtaking coldness, a frantic attempt to replace one form of dominance with another, proving that Cullen Davis was incapable of existing without a human shield to deflect the silence of his own soul. Priscilla Davis was everything the Iceman was not, and everything he secretly craved and despised. She was not a blue-blooded debutante from the Fort Worth Country Club set. She was a force of nature wrapped in platinum blonde hair and tight leather. She was brash, loud, and unapologetically vulgar, a woman who wore her ambition like war paint. The shock of her public persona galvanized Texas society. She famously wore a diamond-encrusted necklace that spelled out the words "rich bitch" in capital letters, a piece of jewelry that cost more than most families earned in a decade. That necklace was not an accessory, it was a declaration of war against modesty. It was a middle finger to the polite, old-money aristocracy that looked down on her. Priscilla reveled in the schadenfreude of making the elite uncomfortable. She drank, she swore, and she partied with a ferocity that matched the heat of the Texas sun. The dynamic between them was toxic from the inception. Cullen, the repressed control freak, believed he had purchased a trophy wife, a stunning mannequin to drape in furs and display at galas to validate his masculinity. He wanted a silent partner who would look good in the passenger seat of his Cadillac. Instead, he got a hurricane. Priscilla refused to be tamed. She refused to sit quietly in the corner of the Stonegate mansion while the men talked business. She demanded attention, she demanded money, and she demanded the right to exist on her own terms. The indignation arises from Cullen's reaction to her autonomy. When he realized he couldn't control her mind, he tried to break her body. The rumor engine of the 1970s buzzed with dark tales of what happened behind the closed doors of Stonegate. The violence was not a singular event, it was a climate. Whispers circulated about broken bones, black eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses, and screams echoing through the ventilation shafts of the mansion. Cullen, the man who controlled an industrial empire with a whisper, allegedly used his fists to enforce domestic policy. He tapped her phones. He hired private investigators to trail her cars. He turned their marriage into a surveillance state, obsessed with the idea that she was mocking him behind his back. The relationship devolved into a psychotic game of cat and mouse where love was replaced by a possessive rage that bordered on madness. The breaking point arrived in 1974, initiating one of the most acrimonious and expensive divorce battles in American history. When Priscilla finally filed for divorce, she didn't just leave. She declared total war. The legal skirmish that followed exposed the rotting underbelly of the Davis lifestyle to the public. It was a spectacle of greed and hatred that riveted the nation. But the true humiliation for Cullen, the moment that likely shattered his psyche, came from the bench. Judge Joe Eidson, presiding over the volatile case, issued a temporary order that was unthinkable to a man of Cullen's stature. He ordered Cullen to vacate Stonegate. Imagine the schadenfreude of the Fort Worth public. The billionaire, the king of oil, was kicked out of his own $6 million castle, forced to live in a modest bachelor pad, while his estranged wife, the rich bitch, stayed behind in the fortress, throwing parties and spending his money. It was a castration of his power. Priscilla remained in the mansion, living with her new lover, the towering ex-basketball player Stan Farr, and her 12-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Andrea Wilborn. Every day that Priscilla lived in Stonegate was an insult to Cullen. She was living in the monument he built for himself, sleeping in his bed and swimming in his pool with another man. To a narcissist like Cullen Davis, this was not a legal setback. It was a spiritual annihilation. The tension escalated with every court date. The financial stakes were staggering. Texas is a community property state, and Priscilla was gunning for a significant chunk of the Davis empire. She wasn't asking for millions. She was asking for tens of millions. Cullen watched as his fortune, the only thing that gave him identity, was threatened by the woman he hated most in the world. The violence of his rhetoric increased. He reportedly told friends that he would see her dead before he saw her with his money. The rumor engine suggests he solicited multiple people to kill her long before the actual shooting, treating the murder of his wife as just another business transaction to be negotiated. By the summer of 1976, the atmosphere was apocalyptic. On August 2nd, the devastating blow landed. The judge issued a ruling that increased Priscilla's monthly support payments from $3,500 to $5,000 and ordered Cullen to pay her legal fees, which were astronomical. It was a clear signal that Cullen was losing the war. The courts were siding with the rich bitch. The system he thought he owned was turning against him. The disgust one feels reviewing this timeline is rooted in the presence of the innocent. Caught in the crossfire of this titan clash was little Andrea Wilborn. She was a child, a pawn in a game of adult hatred. She lived in the mansion, surrounded by the toxicity, the drugs, and the anger. She was the collateral damage of a marriage that had rotted into a feud. While Cullen and Priscilla fought over diamonds and oil leases, the safety of the child was ignored. The hatred Cullen felt for Priscilla extended to everything she touched, including her children. He viewed Andrea not as a girl, but as an extension of the woman who was stealing his life. The stage was set for the massacre. The marriage had dissolved into pure vitriol. The law had failed to separate them cleanly. The money had become a noose. Cullen Davis, the man who had everything, sat in his lonely apartment, stewing in a broth of rage and humiliation. He had lost his father, he had lost his house, and now he was about to lose his fortune. The Iceman had reached his melting point. The divorce papers were no longer enough. The only way to reclaim his castle and his dignity was to erase the occupants. The marriage of the devil was about to end, not with a gavel, but with a gun. The suffocating heat of the Texas summer night on August 2nd, 1976, lay over the Stonegate mansion like a funeral shroud. The estate, usually a beacon of hedonistic noise, was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the hum of the $1 million air conditioning units fighting the humidity. This was the night the castle of debauchery transformed into an abattoir. The events that unfolded within the marble walls serve as the ultimate crescendo of the Davis tragedy, a collision of unthinkable wealth and primitive violence that shattered the psyche of Fort Worth forever. It was not a robbery gone wrong, it was a liquidation event. The intruder did not come for the silver or the art, he came to erase human beings. The horror began in the basement. This detail alone evokes a sickening sense of indignation. While the adults were out navigating the social minefields of the city, 12-year-old Andrea Wilborn, Priscilla's daughter, was home alone. She had just returned from Bible camp, a fragile innocent surrounded by the oppressive luxury of a house built on hate. She was in the basement laundry room, perhaps feeling safe in the fortress her stepfather had built. But the security system designed to keep the poor out was useless against the man who held the master keys. The killer entered quietly. He was dressed in all black, a phantom figure wearing a long black wig and holding a .38 caliber revolver wrapped in a plastic garbage bag to catch the shell casings, a forensic countermeasure that speaks to premeditation, not passion. He found Andrea alone. There was no struggle. There was no screaming argument. The evidence suggests a terrifying, cold intimacy. The killer forced the child to kneel on the cold floor. He placed the barrel of the gun against the back of her head, execution style, and pulled the trigger. The shock disgust of this moment is absolute. It was a sterile, mechanical act. He blew out the life of a 12-year-old girl not because she was a threat, but because she was an asset of his enemy. He left her small body on the floor, bleeding into the expensive concrete, and then he waited. Ideally, a predator kills and leaves. This predator killed and sat in the dark, waiting for the rest of his prey to come home. Around midnight, the headlights of Priscilla's Lincoln Continental swept across the driveway. She was accompanied by her lover, Stan Farr, a towering former TCU basketball player, standing 6'9". They were returning from a dinner, oblivious to the fact that they were walking into a slaughterhouse. As they entered the kitchen, the security alarm began to chime, a mundane sound that would soon be replaced by the roar of gunfire. The figure in black emerged from the shadows of the hallway. Priscilla Davis looked at the man. In the split second before the violence erupted, she saw the face. Despite the wig, despite the context, she recognized the eyes. They were the dead, flat eyes of the man she had married. She screamed his name, Cullen. The response was a bullet. The killer raised the .38 and fired at point-blank range. The bullet struck Priscilla in the chest, tearing through her breastbone. The physics of the wound were devastating, but miraculously, the angle was just shallow enough to miss her heart. The force knocked her backward, blood spraying across the designer kitchen tiles. She didn't die. She went into a primal state of survival. Then the killer turned his attention to the giant. Stan Farr was a massive man, physically capable of crushing Cullen Davis with his bare hands. But he was unarmed, and he was caught in the fatal lag time of confusion. He charged the shooter, a desperate attempt to protect Priscilla. The killer fired again and again. One bullet shattered Stan's arm, another pierced his chest. The struggle was brutal and chaotic. Stan Farr, utilizing his last reserves of strength, tried to hold back the assassin, buying Priscilla precious seconds. The killer finished him with a final callous shot to the back as he fell. The Iceman had taken down the giant. The kitchen of the Stonegate mansion was now a scene of carnage that rivaled a battlefield. The white floors slick with the commingled blood of a wife and a lover. But the night was not done with its victims. The randomness of the violence adds a layer of schadenfreude-tinged tragedy for the unintended guests. As the shooting was taking place, a young couple, Bubba Gavril and his girlfriend Beverly Bass, pulled up to the mansion. They were there for a late-night visit, expecting a party, expecting drinks. They walked into a nightmare. They found the house dark, the air thick with the metallic smell of gunpowder. The killer stepped out onto the patio to meet them. He didn't hesitate. He raised the gun and fired at Bubba. The bullet struck him in the spine. Bubba Gavril, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, dropped instantly. Paralyzed from the waist down, he would never walk again. The cruelty was casual. The killer then turned the gun on Beverly Bass, but the weapon clicked. It was empty or jammed. In that microsecond of mechanical failure, the instinct for self-preservation took over. Beverly Bass ran. Priscilla Davis, bleeding profusely from the hole in her chest, also ran. The image of these two terrified women sprinting through the darkness of the manicured estate, scrambling over the $6 million fences, diving into the bushes to escape the lord of the manor, is the defining visual of the Davis collapse. They were hunted like animals in a private safari park. Priscilla managed to reach a neighbor's house, pounding on the door, covered in blood, screaming that her husband was killing everyone. The neighbors, waking up to this gothic horror show, called the police. When the sirens finally wailed in the distance, cutting through the humid Texas air, the killer vanished. He slipped away into the night as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind a house full of corpses and crippled survivors. The police arrived to find a scene of grotesquerie. The sheer opulence of the setting made the violence look even more obscene. The expensive art on the walls looked down on the body of Stan Farr. The tunnels and secret passageways, once the source of titillation for party guests, were now potential hiding spots for a monster. And in the basement, the discovery of little Andrea Wilborn broke the composure of even the most hardened detectives. A child, executed alone in the dark. The identification was immediate and unanimous. Priscilla Davis, fighting for her life in the hospital, told the detectives without hesitation, "It was Cullen. He did it. He killed Andrea." Beverly Bass, the survivor of the patio ambush, confirmed the description. Bubba Gavril, paralyzed on a stretcher, identified the man. 3 witnesses, 3 identifications, a motive as old as time, jealousy, greed, and hate. The forensic narrative seemed airtight. The richest man in Fort Worth had finally snapped, turning his fortress into a tomb. Yet, as the sun rose over Stonegate the next morning, illuminating the bloodstains on the patio, the machinery of the Davis empire began to whir into motion. Cullen Davis was found hours later at the home of his girlfriend, Karen Master. He was calm. He was sleeping. He acted confused, claiming he had been in bed all night, heavily sedated with sleeping pills. The Iceman was back in character. He looked at the police with those dead eyes and denied everything. The contrast was jarring. The bloody chaos at the mansion versus the serene, sterile denial of the billionaire. The tragedy of that night is not just the loss of life. It is the realization of what followed. The blood on the floor of Stonegate was real. The body of the 12-year-old girl was real. But in the world of Cullen Davis, reality was negotiable. As the police slapped the handcuffs on his wrists, creating the most sensational mugshot in Texas history, the rumor engine was already pivoting. The narrative was shifting from mass murderer to defendant. And in America, a defendant with $1 billion is a very different creature from a defendant with nothing. The massacre was over, but the true obscenity, the purchase of innocence, was just beginning. The victims had died in the dark, but their memory was about to be dragged through the mud in the harsh fluorescent light of a courtroom. The arrest of Thomas Cullen Davis on the morning of August 3, 1976, seemed to the detectives like the closing of a steel trap. The evidence was overwhelming, the eyewitnesses were unanimous, and the motive was etched in the bitter acid of divorce filings for all to see. In any other jurisdiction, for any other defendant, the path from the handcuffs to the electric chair would have been a straight, inevitable line. But in Texas, and specifically in the gravity well of the Davis billions, the laws of physics do not apply. The legal proceedings that followed were not a search for truth. They were a demonstration of the terrifying liquidity of American justice. This was the moment the Davis empire deployed its most potent weapon, not a gun, but a checkbook. The trial became the most expensive murder defense in history up to that point, a spectacle that proved with sickening clarity that guilt is a variable dependent entirely on the quality of the illusionist one can afford to hire. The defense team assembled by Cullen Davis was not merely legal counsel. It was a mercenary army operating with an unlimited war chest. At the helm stood Richard Racehorse Haynes, a diminutive, flamboyant Houston attorney with a reputation for winning the unwinnable. Haynes was less a lawyer and more a dark magician, a master of courtroom theatrics who understood that a jury does not need to believe the defendant is innocent. They only need to be confused enough to doubt he is guilty. The fee for this defense was astronomical, rumored to be in the millions, a sum that allowed them to outspend the state of Texas at every turn. While the prosecutors were public servants working for a government salary, Racehorse Haynes and his team were operating with the resources of a small nation. They hired private investigators to dig through the trash cans of the witnesses. They hired forensic experts to contradict the state's science. They turned the courtroom into a private theater where they controlled the lighting, the script, and the audience. The strategy Haynes employed was a scorched earth policy known as attacking the victim. Racehorse Haynes knew he couldn't whitewash Cullen Davis. The man was too cold, too unlikable, too visibly arrogant. So he decided to dirty the victims. He put the corpses on trial. The defense narrative was simple and brutal. Priscilla Davis was not a grieving mother and a survivor of domestic violence. She was a drug-addicted, sexually promiscuous deviant who lived in a cesspool of vice. They dragged the rich bitch persona into the center of the courtroom and beat it to death, gambling that the conservative Texas jury would be so repulsed by her lifestyle that they would forget about the bullet hole in her chest. The courtroom became a stage for the assassination of character. The defense introduced salacious details about the parties at Stonegate, the cocaine use, the sexual fluidity of Priscilla's circle. They painted a picture of a house so depraved that violence was inevitable. The subliminal message was chilling. Look at how these people lived. Look at the drugs. Look at the sex. Did they not invite this doom upon themselves? It was a masterclass in cruelty. They managed to make the jury look away from the 12-year-old girl bleeding on the basement floor and focus instead on the sexual history of her mother. They turned Priscilla from a victim into a villain, suggesting that her lifestyle was the true killer. The cross-examination of Priscilla Davis stands as one of the most brutal spectacles in legal history. Racehorse Haynes spent days dissecting her life, mocking her pain, and challenging her memory. He questioned her sobriety on the night of the shooting. He questioned her eyesight. He questioned her morality. He forced her to relive the execution of her daughter while simultaneously insinuating that she was too high on Percodan to know who pulled the trigger. By the end of her testimony, Priscilla was no longer seen as a credible eyewitness. She was seen as damaged goods, a hysterical woman whose word was worthless against the calm, steely denial of the billionaire in the expensive suit. To counter the physical evidence, the defense deployed the infamous ABC defense, anybody but Cullen. They threw up a cloud of chaff, spinning wild, unsubstantiated theories to distract the jury. They suggested that the hit was a drug deal gone wrong, targeting Priscilla's boyfriend, Stan Farr. They suggested it was a professional hitman hired by a mysterious enemy. They suggested it was a jealous lover from Priscilla's past. It didn't matter that none of these theories had a shred of proof. They only needed to exist as possibilities. Haynes was throwing sand in the eyes of the jury, blinding them to the obvious reality that the only person with a motive, the means, and the opportunity was sitting right there at the defense table. The forensic evidence was dismantled with surgical precision. The defense attacked the identification. It was dark, they argued. The killer wore a wig. The killer wore black. Priscilla was traumatized. How could she be sure? They exploited the fragility of human memory, turning the witness's certainty into confusion. They mocked the idea that a billionaire would do his own dirty work. Why would Cullen Davis, a man who could buy anything, risk the electric chair by pulling the trigger himself? Wouldn't he hire someone? This twisted logic appealed to the jury's subconscious bias. They couldn't reconcile the image of the wealthy oil baron with the image of the masked gunman. The violence was too primitive for a man of his stature. It was a cognitive dissonance purchased by the defense team. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was surreal. Cullen Davis sat through the trial with the same icy detachment he displayed in business meetings. He chewed gum, he took notes, he signed autographs during recess. He treated the trial not as a fight for his life, but as a tedious board meeting he had to endure. His arrogance was armored by his bank account. He knew deep down that the rules were different for him. While Bubba Gavriel sat in his wheelchair, paralyzed for life, watching the man who shot him smirk at the jury, the injustice of the universe was on full display. The contrast was physically painful. The broken bodies of the victims versus the manicured hands of the defendant. The climax of this legal farce arrived on November 17th, 1977. After a 4-month trial and days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. When the foreman read the words "not guilty," the shockwave was physical. Priscilla Davis screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the mahogany walls. The prosecutors slumped in their chairs, defeated by the weight of the Davis fortune. The reaction of the jury remains a point of deep cynicism. Later interviews revealed that they had been successfully seduced by the lifestyle defense. They judged Priscilla, not Cullen. They couldn't get past the rich bitch necklace and the sex parties. They decided that in a war between a degenerate wife and a wealthy husband, the husband deserved the benefit of the doubt. But the most sickening image came moments after the verdict. A photograph captured Cullen Davis grinning, flashing a thumbs-up sign, celebrating his freedom. He didn't look like a man relieved to be spared from a false accusation. He looked like a man who had just closed a difficult business deal. That night, Cullen Davis went out to dinner at a steakhouse to celebrate. He ate a prime rib while the body of Andrea Wilborn lay in a grave he had dug for her. The message was broadcast to the world. In Texas, you can execute a child in a basement, shoot your wife, cripple a bystander, and murder a lover. And if you have enough money to hire Racehorse Haynes, you will walk out the front door a free man. The acquittal of Cullen Davis was not a failure of the justice system. It was the system working exactly as designed for the ultra-wealthy. It was the ultimate transaction. He had bought his life back, paying for it with the reputation of his dead stepdaughter and the ruins of his wife's sanity. The Iceman had frozen hell over, and he walked across the ice without a scratch. If the acquittal in the Stonegate massacre was a tragedy of justice, what followed in 1978 was a farce of such grotesque proportions that it defies rational belief. Most men, having narrowly escaped the electric chair for a mass murder they almost certainly committed, would retreat into a life of quiet penitence. They would vanish from the public eye, counting their blessings in the shadows. But Thomas Cullen Davis was not most men. He was a creature of colossal hubris, emboldened by a verdict that he interpreted not as a stroke of luck, but as a confirmation of his invincibility. The system had blinked, and he had won. This arrogance led him directly into the second, darker chapter of his legal saga, a plot so brazen that it reads like a rejected screenplay for a cheap noir thriller. The Iceman wasn't satisfied with merely surviving. He wanted to finish the job. The target list was no longer just his wife. It now included the very machinery of the law itself. The catalyst for this new nightmare was the ongoing ruinous divorce. Despite the acquittal, the civil war over the Davis fortune was still raging. Judge Joe Eidson, the man who had kicked Cullen out of his mansion and frozen his assets, was still presiding over the case. To Cullen, Eidson was not an impartial arbiter. He was an obstacle to be removed, no different than a competitor in the oil fields. It was in this climate of festering rage that Cullen allegedly reached out to an old acquaintance named David McCrory. McCrory was a hanger-on in the Davis orbit, a man who had enjoyed the fringes of the billionaire's lifestyle. Cullen viewed him as a tool, a reliable fix-it man for dirty work. According to the prosecution, Cullen offered McCrory a simple contract, $25,000 to kill Judge Joe Eidson, and eventually to finish off Priscilla Davis. But the dynamic had shifted. McCrory, perhaps sensing the radioactive nature of his friend, or perhaps growing a conscience, went to the FBI. What followed was a sting operation that stands as a monument to the surreal theatricality of law enforcement in the 1970s. The FBI didn't just want to catch Cullen talking. They wanted to catch him paying for a corpse. On August 20th, 1978, federal agents staged a macabre tableau. They took Judge Joe Eidson, a sitting jurist, drove him to a secluded location, and asked him to climb into the trunk of a car. They tore his shirt, covered him in tomato juice to simulate blood, and instructed him to play dead. Agents snapped Polaroid photographs of the murdered judge, creating the grim proof of performance that the client demanded. It is a scene of profound absurdity, a pillar of the legal community lying in a trunk, covered in condiments, acting out his own death to trap a billionaire. The trap was sprung in a parking lot of a Coco's restaurant in Fort Worth. Surveillance vans were parked nearby, recording devices whirring silently. David McCrory met with Cullen Davis in the front seat of a car. The transcript of this meeting is one of the most damning documents in criminal history. McCrory showed Cullen the photo of the dead judge. Cullen stared at the image of his nemesis, seemingly executed. He didn't recoil in horror. He didn't panic. According to the tapes, he looked at the photo and allegedly smiled, offering a chilling words of approval. Good job. Then came the transaction. Cullen handed McCrory an envelope containing $25,000 in cash. He also reportedly discussed the next targets on the list, a terrifying expansion of the hit list that included Priscilla. As Cullen stepped out of the car, the FBI swooped in. "Cullen Davis, FBI." The shout echoed across the asphalt. Agents surrounded him, guns drawn. They had him cold. They had the tapes, they had the money, they had the photos, they had the confession of the hitman. It was the perfect case. There was no ABC defense this time. There was no mystery gunman in a wig. It was Cullen on tape paying for a murder. But they forgot one variable, Racehorse Haynes. The trial that followed was a master class in gaslighting. Confronted with audio and video evidence that seemed incontrovertible, the defense team didn't deny that Cullen was in the car. They didn't deny he handed over the money. Instead, they constructed a narrative so audacious, so conspiratorial, that it short-circuited the logic of the jury. They argued the conspiracy hypothesis. The defense claimed that Cullen Davis was not the perpetrator. He was the victim. They spun a tale that Cullen knew McCrory was working with the FBI or Priscilla all along. They claimed that Cullen was playing the role of a double agent, pretending to go along with the murder plot to gather evidence against McCrory and expose a blackmail ring orchestrated by Priscilla Davis. According to this twisted logic, when Cullen said "good job" while looking at the photo of the dead judge, he was acting. When he handed over the $25,000, he wasn't paying for a hit. He was paying a bribe to keep McCrory close so he could turn him over to the authorities later. It was the "I was just pretending to be a murderer" defense. To any rational observer, this sounded like the desperate fabrication of a guilty man. Why would a billionaire play amateur detective instead of calling the police? Why would he not report the solicitation immediately? Yet the defense weaponized the jury's distrust of the government and their deep-seated misogyny against Priscilla. They painted the FBI as incompetent bunglers who had been manipulated by the vindictive ex-wife. They argued that Priscilla Davis, the rich bitch, was the mastermind, framing her ex-husband to secure her divorce settlement. They turned the courtroom into a hall of mirrors where nothing was real. The audio tapes were reinterpreted. The context was shifted. The clear words of a man ordering a hit were twisted into the confused ramblings of a man trying to outsmart a blackmailer. The result was a hung jury in the first trial. The state, stunned but determined, retried the case. In the second trial, the defense refined their conspiracy theory, hammering home the idea that Cullen was the target of a massive setup. And then the impossible happened again. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty. The shock wave of this second acquittal was different from the first. The first was a tragedy. The second was a confirmation of a broken reality. The public realized that there was no bottom to the well of corruption. A man had been caught on tape paying for the murder of a judge, and he walked free because his lawyers told a better story than the FBI. The verdict suggested that if you are rich enough, reality is malleable. You can rewrite the script of your own crimes in real time. Cullen Davis walked out of the courthouse, once again a free man, but this victory was Pyrrhic. The conspiracy hypothesis had saved him from prison, but it couldn't save his empire. The legal fees for 2 murder trials and 2 solicitation trials were astronomical. The oil market was crashing. The banks were calling in their loans. The Iceman had beaten the law, but he couldn't beat the economy. He stood in the wreckage of his reputation, a man who had spent millions to prove he wasn't a killer, only to be left with nothing but his freedom and the ghosts of the people he was accused of destroying. The FBI trap had snapped shut, but the rat had chewed off its own leg to escape, leaving a trail of blood and money that led nowhere. The ending of the Cullen Davis saga is not written in the ink of a court verdict, but in the rust of a collapsed empire. It serves as a grim reminder that while a man can buy a jury, he cannot bribe the laws of economics or the relentless march of time. By the dawn of the 1980s, Thomas Cullen Davis stood as a free man, having successfully navigated 2 of the most treacherous murder trials in American history. He had defeated the district attorney, humiliated the FBI, and outmaneuvered the entire justice system of Texas. He appeared invincible, but he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unaware that the ground beneath his feet, the oil-soaked foundation of his family's wealth, was about to crumble into dust. The Iceman had survived the fire, but he would not survive the winter that followed. The mechanism of his destruction was far more impartial than any judge. In the mid-1980s, the price of crude oil, the lifeblood of the Davis fortune, plummeted. The Davis Industries conglomerate, which had once been an unstoppable juggernaut worth nearly $1 billion, was revealed to be a fragile giant, over-leveraged and rotten with mismanagement. While Cullen had been busy fighting for his life in courtrooms, spending millions of dollars on lawyers and private investigators, his business had been bleeding. The banks, once eager to lend to the Davis name, suddenly turned predatory. They called in the loans. They seized the assets. The empire that Stinky Davis had built from the dirt was dismantled piece by piece by creditors who cared nothing for the family legacy. In 1985, Davis Industries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy in Fort Worth history at the time. The humiliation was absolute. Cullen Davis, the man who once treated the city as his personal fiefdom, was stripped of his crown. He lost the company, he lost the jets, he lost the power. But the most symbolic loss was Stonegate, the $6 million fortress of solitude, the scene of the massacre, the castle of debauchery. It was foreclosed upon. The mansion that had been built to intimidate the world was sold for pennies on the dollar. The fate of the mansion itself became a dark joke, fueling local whispers for decades. It was purchased by a group of investors who tried to turn it into a tourist attraction. It became a steakhouse. It became a church. It became a Mexican restaurant. Families ate enchiladas in the very rooms where Priscilla Davis had been shot and Andrea Wilborn had been executed. The bloodstains were covered with cheap carpet, the bullet holes patched with drywall, but the ghosts refused to leave. The businesses failed one by one. The house was cursed. Eventually, the land was deemed more valuable than the structure. The mansion was bulldozed, reduced to a pile of rubble and twisted steel. The tunnels were filled in, the pool was buried, and the Castle of the Devil was erased from the map, replaced by a generic housing development. The physical erasure of Cullen's ego was complete. Amidst this financial apocalypse, Cullen Davis executed his final, most cynical maneuver. The man accused of ordering hits and murdering children declared that he had found Jesus. He became a born-again Christian. He joined a charismatic church and began preaching the gospel of forgiveness. He appeared on televangelism programs, sitting next to preachers with shiny suits, weeping crocodile tears about his sinful past. Here was a man who had never admitted guilt, never apologized to the families of the victims, never spent a day in prison for the carnage he unleashed, now standing in a pulpit claiming to be washed in the blood of the Lamb. He publicly smashed his collection of Asian deities and jade idols with a sledgehammer, claiming they were graven images that had led him astray. It was a performative act of piety that felt hollow and calculated. Cullen Davis had lost his identity as the billionaire oil man, so he adopted the persona of the redeemed sinner. It was a convenient shield. Who could attack a man who claimed to be a humble servant of God? It was the ultimate defense. Anybody but Cullen, because Cullen is now a saint. While Cullen was busy polishing his halo, the victims of his chaos suffered the slow, grinding tragedy of reality. Priscilla Davis, the rich bitch, who had fought him to a standstill, did not find a happy ending. The acquittal broke something in her. She lived the rest of her life in the shadow of the injustice. The millions she had fought for in the divorce largely evaporated in legal fees and bad investments. She died of breast cancer in 2001, a diminished figure, still insisting with her dying breath that Cullen was the man behind the mask. She never got justice. She never got peace. She only got the bitter satisfaction of outliving the empire, if not the emperor. Karen Master, the girlfriend who provided the critical alibi that saved Cullen's life, testifying he was sleeping beside her when the shots were fired, married him immediately after the trial. But even that loyalty was rewarded with hardship. They lived a modest, almost middle-class existence, a far cry from the jet-setting luxury of the 1970s. The Iceman was forced to work for his brother Bill, selling skincare products, a humiliating demotion for a man who once controlled the energy sector. Today, the legacy of Cullen Davis is a scar on the history of Texas. He stands as the precursor to O.J. Simpson, the original proof that the American legal system has a price tag. He lives on, an elderly man existing in the quiet obscurity of a world that has largely moved on, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own reputation. He walks free, but he is a prisoner of the past. When people hear the name Davis in Fort Worth, they do not think of the oil or the philanthropy or the born-again preacher. They think of the wig. They think of the black garbage bag wrapped around a revolver. They think of the 12-year-old girl kneeling in the basement. The final verdict on Cullen Davis was not delivered by a jury foreman, but by fate itself. He kept his freedom, but he lost everything that made that freedom sweet. He kept his life, but he lost his legacy. He is a king without a crown, a billionaire without a dime, a man who bought his innocence but sold his soul in the transaction. The oil wells are dry, the mansion is dust, and the money is gone. All that remains is the blood, and no amount of time, money, or prayer can ever wash it away. The Iceman beat the rap, but in the end, he became nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in the dark, a story about a man who tried to buy the world and ended up owning nothing but a graveyard.